everyone. Hello to those online. I'm Kristi. As mentioned, I'm the director for the Office of Pre-Market Additive Safety, and I've been working in the area of safety and risk assessment for FDA-regulated products for about 20 years, most of that time in the food additive space. Sometime in pharmaceutical, especially drug impurities. So I've had a nice opportunity to see the similarities and differences in those regulatory approaches. And as Mark noted, it is quite a dynamic and interesting time right now as a federal regulator, especially in FDA foods. I was really glad and happy that Mark teed up some of what are the priorities, what's changing, what are we working on. There is a lot, I think, to come, and we are actively working to meet those challenges. And I just want to start by saying I'm incredibly lucky and proud and honored to have a team under us that has been able to not only keep the work going, but adjust quickly and respond to the multitude of varied asks that are coming very, very rapidly, and some related and some very unrelated types of areas. It's just been a remarkable testament of the excellence that we have within the FDA. With all of that newness and change, though, I've decided I'm definitely getting old because I'm a scientist by training. But when I was a kid, my uncles and aunts, everybody older than me was so interested in history, and I just wasn't. And I am like becoming so interested in history. So I've decided it's a mark of my age. And I have to acknowledge the long history and acknowledgement that substances used by the food industry must be safe, and where our origins for that really are. And maybe just in the room, by a show of hands, who's familiar or read about Wiley and his Poison Squad? Yeah, Wiley and the Poison Squad. For those of you who haven't, I truly recommend it. You don't even have to be recently obsessed with history to enjoy it. It's a really interesting story. And back in the late 19th, early 20th century, there were some really nefarious things happening in the food supply in the United States. Industry was doing some things with true malintent. Some of the examples are adding sawdust to ground coffee to try to stretch their profit margins and purposely trick consumers. Some of them were adding spices and other things to rancid meats to keep these things on the market for longer. Some things happening in the food industry at that time were not as malicious. They were just due to a lack of knowledge and information at the time. They were adding foods to improve manufacturing, to stretch shelf life, to make food more appealing to consumers, and they just didn't have data or information on those substances. There was no reason to know they were bad. We just didn't know if they were good or okay or safe. And so this time, Wiley and his Poison Squad, their work, their advocacy led to the institution of the FDA. And really, when I look and I know and I learn that story, and I look at the work of what the Office of Pre-Market Additive Safety is, we really are the evolution of Wiley and his Poison Squad. At that time, it was, and this is how it is described, Wiley and a small group of young, strong men literally went into a room in a federal building in a basement and ate food to see, would they get sick? And this is really the foundation of the US regulatory system, which says that any substance used by industry must have data to demonstrate that it's safe before it can come onto the market. Now, if you think about that, when you say any substance that can be used by industry, think about something as simple. This is I think globally, we're talking about globally. Globally, everybody agrees with this. Industry agrees with this, consumers agree with this, advocates agree with this. This is a simple concept. Your food should be safe. This is a simple concept that everybody agrees with. And any substance used should be safe. I think people generally would agree with that too. globally in all different sectors. Any substance used should be safe. It should be safe based on the way it's being used, right? These are foundational things that people agree on that get really complex when you talk about the science and the regulations that go into supporting them. If you think about something as simple as like an apple pie, right? We talk any substance, apple pie, so all American. The apples that go into the apple pie, okay, they're safe. The apple filling that goes into the apple pie, what goes into the apple filling, what goes into the pie crust, the dough conditioners, things that make it elasticized, the parts that go into that dough, that needs to be safe. Well, any substance in the US extends to even the packaging, the cellophane that you may put around that pie, the box, the paper box that pie goes into, all the things that go into that cellophane and into that paper box. These are all very different types of substances. You think of the apples to the chemicals that are used to coat paper and paperboard. We're talking about a really broad group of substances and a really broad group of uses. And so this is becomes something that seems so foundationally true. Any substance use should be safe. How you translate that into science and regulations that can support that as a government, we are doing that work and industry is meeting its responsibility to make sure that substances on the market are safe. So this, before we get into regulatory, I just want to take a minute and talk about the evolution of this science, because we've come a long way from Wiley's Poison Squad, a bunch of people, a bunch of strong young men eating food in a basement to determine if it's safe. And this is really a complex science from those early 1900s to where we are now in 2025. We've really developed the field of toxicology. We've really developed the field of biochemistry, molecular biology, exposure science, polymer science, metabolism, pathology, chemical degradation. These are all the pieces of science and information that go into informing whether or not the use of a substance in food is safe. And this is the expertise that it now takes for us to be certain that when we've received a package of information, we have the right experts, we're asking these questions, we understand what are the fundamental things, the fundamental questions that any safety assessment, whether it being conducted by industry, whether it be conducted by a federal regulator in the FDA or around the globe, whether it be done by an academic, whether it be done as part of a lab, what are the fundamental elements that this body of research and this body of science is aiming to answer? I've boiled this down to 3 general buckets of information. And in the FDA, this is how we talk about it. First is, well, what is the substance? It seems like a simple question. What is the substance? This is often a very complicated question. It's almost sometimes one of the most complicated questions. Not just what is the substance, how do we chemically define it? Often it's a mixture of substances. How is that substance made? What might come along for the ride in the making of the substance? Are there any impurities or constituents? How might that substance degrade over its lifespan? So do you have degradants in that substance? What's the substance? Now, how is it being used? Is this being added in a limited amount? It's going to be in all foods? Is it only going to be in some foods? How is this substance being used so that we can answer the question of how much are people going to be exposed to this substance and its cohort of impurities, constituents, ride-along products, degradants, metabolites? How much are people going to be exposed to this substance? And we're talking about food here. So we're going to assume that you're going to eat food every day over your entire lifespan through sensitive windows of exposure. Pregnant and nursing women is one for sure. We need to make sure they're not eating different food. I'm a regulator, I'm not eating different food. We all want to be eating safe food all the time. We're going to eat it over our entire lifespan, and we're going to be exposed to this substance and cohort of substances every day up to some amount for our entire lifetime. Then the third piece of information is, okay, so now we know what it is. We know how much we're going to be exposed to it. How much can we have every day? And be sure that that's safe. What is that upper bound level of exposure that we have to ensure safety of this substance. So these are the three fundamental concepts. And in my work over nearly 20, maybe more years doing this work, these three fundamental questions and the data and information used, this is the type of information that safety assessors across the globe are asking and seeking information for. So we've taken this really simple concept, everything needs to be safe. We've added a lot of complex science and data on top of it to acknowledge we're going to need a lot of data and information to be able to answer this question. And now we've added on top of it very complex regulatory pathways and programs that are interconnected. Within the FDA, we've got 4 major regulatory programs. Each of these programs have their own unique elements. We have the food contact notification program for that packaging and substances used in packaging. We have a color additive petition process for colors that are added to food. Mark mentioned these. We have the food additive petition process. The food additive petition results in a regulation for the specific use. And then we have the voluntary GRAS notification process. And each of these processes have their own uniqueness to them, and some of them certainly have some limitations. We've heard a lot about the GRAS notification program and the call to improve that program and address this issue of the FDA not being aware of what's in our food supply. And we are certainly working on that. The Secretary has directed, and as Mark mentioned, we've already started that work in terms of how we could update that regulation to improve that process. So if you think about industry's responsibility, they've got to consider what is the substance that they're using, what safety and data and information they need, and then which regulatory program they need to come through to ensure that their substance is safe and appropriately regulated. And now I've just explained the US process to you, and we're talking about globally. So across the globe, they're using different regulatory processes. In the EU, they have a food additives program. They also have a novel foods program. They also have a completely different approach that they take to food packaging. So this fundamental concept of it must be safe that is generally unifying us across the globe, we have different regulatory processes for these. And so there are, and there have been big calls, mostly by industry, for us to unify across. I can't blame them. Industry would love it if they'd say, hey, we have the same regulatory approach and system to food additives and substances in food. Generally, globally, that would certainly make their regulatory burden a lot easier. And there are some, and while there is, each government is going to maintain its autonomy, there are some organizations that do try to help and approach with this. We have the Codex and the JECFA committees that do global evaluation. And this is really where it takes strong participation across these different experts from different government organizations to come together and look and say, here are substances that are used globally within the food supply that would benefit from a unified standard and an independent body of experts coming together and determining what is that safe level. How much can we be assured would be safe within the food supply? These are organizations that we really support, because not only do they provide some of that global foundation and consensus and expert assessment, they provide a great opportunity for our experts to meet with other global experts in this space, hear about the approaches that they're taking, discuss what's evolving in the regulatory and the safety-based spaces, try to unify where we can and tackle common and emerging challenges. I think we're going to hear about NAMs later today. For instance, NAMs is certainly one of them. But this complex regulatory framework that we have and this deep, complicated science that goes into making this safety decision raises some additional challenges in terms of communication and being able to demonstrate to consumers that industry, regulators, all of us are meeting the burden to be able to say, we have really moved on from the time of Wiley and his poison squad, and we really can say we have some of the safest food in the world because we're doing this work. These regional differences result in some differences, especially in terms of naming. different substances that are used across the globe are called different things in different regions. There are going to be some regional differences. There certainly will be some things that are allowed within the US that are not allowed in other regions. There are going to be some things that are allowed in other regions that are not allowed in the US. This provides a lot of opportunity for those who are watching to say, well, what is going on? Why is that? Explain that to me. Often this causes a lot of often there is a good reason, a long reason, a complicated reason, but a very technical and not very interesting reason that's not very satisfying. But this creates a lot of opportunities for misunderstanding and misinformation within the community. And so it brings me around to the area that I really want to close on as it relates to transparency. I've talked a lot about science. I've talked a lot and the complexity there, a lot about regulations and the complexity there in the global market. But I didn't talk a lot about communications and transparency. And I do think because this is one of the places where we really absolutely can improve. At FDA, we have inventories. And whenever anybody comes into the FDA regulated food space, I go, no, we're so transparent. Have you seen our inventories? Has anybody here seen our inventories? Oh my gosh. Like, I think in the room, I've seen 3 hands out of probably about 30 people in the room. It's not enough. These inventories are a wealth of information. It's every food additive, every color additive, every food contact substance, every GRAS substance that's been evaluated. And for many of these, for the GRAS inventory especially, it's the entire notice, all that scientific information that's been submitted and the FDA review. So you go, oh my gosh, so much information. The problem is this is an inventory built by scientists and regulators for scientists and regulators. So when I find and look for, I need to know what I'm looking for. I need to understand that I might search for it by one chemical name, but understand that there are probably at least good 5 popular synonyms that I should also search for, right? I need to know what I'm looking for. Then I need to recognize I'm going to return a huge dossier of information that I'm going to have to look through and figure out to understand what's the main point. And then if I want to say, well, this is what the US said, well, then what did Europe say? Well, what did Health Canada say? And they've got a similar inventory. So these inventories are a wealth of information, and it's a great start because we have been transparent. For those that's not proactively shared, these safety data is always available by FOIA within the US. Any safety data, any net data information necessary to support the safety decision is required to be releasable under FOIA. So it's either proactively put out or you can get it through FOIA. But we have been trying to improve. And if you look at some of our communications over the last 2 years and some of our websites to provide more plain language and consumer accessible information that boils down all of this complex information to say, here's what the US government has, here's generally what we think, here's how long we've considered this, here's how recently we've considered this. I think this is where, in addition to the things that Mark mentioned in terms of these real priorities and practical things that we need to work on to make improvements in our system and address some of the questions, this is another thing that I think can really improve what we're working on so that we can do a better job of explaining to the consumers so that they can see globally the amount of work that's being done, and that in fact the food system is global. There is more similarities in terms of what the food that you're eating, whether you're in Europe or in Canada or in the US, than there are differences. And with all of the discussion on the differences, we're really around the edges. The approach to safety, the understanding that anything added to food and used by the food industry should be safe and appropriately regulated is a unifying concept that we're all striving to achieve. So with that, I'm stopped because I think I actually am over time, and I yield to the next speaker.